Hello there, Scott Howard with you again for the second in a series of podcasts of my new novel, 3 Days and 2 Nights, An Amusing Arthurian Adventure. The novel's being published again by the Piedmont Journal of Poetry and Fiction. You can go online and read sections. We're serializing it. We'll be publishing a new section every month from now until June online. The website is www.piedmontjpf.com. That's PIEDMONTJPF.com. We will be picking up today where we left off last time. Last time we read the prologue and chapter 1. So just to refresh your memory, 3 Days and 2 Nights is an Arthurian story. It takes place in the waning days of King Arthur's rule. Last time, King Arthur was captured by Malastair, a petty warlord, and his magician, a guy by the name of Rabordath. There's a banshee involved. There's a lot of stuff that happened. But what we found out was that Heather, one of our primary protagonists, has been captured by Malastair, and he was interrogating her in his tower, trying to figure out why Arthur was in his land, and those kinds of things. Ultimately, he didn't have very much success. Today, we're going to meet our other protagonist, a young knight by the name of Aelfric, and we are going to continue to find out what's happening with Heather as well. All right, so here we go. Chapter 2, Lanark Town. To Lord Ghent, written by the hand of Aelfric, your grace's royal servant and knight, always. My liege, in due course of time my travels have taken me north to the most remote and pagan parts of the isle. Here the beating drums of druidism still echo in the forests. Disdain for our Lord is muttered by the goblins in every grove, witches in every seaside shanty, and ogres atop every knoll. It is indeed a clear hiding spot for the cup of kings. Whoever hid it here was as wise as Solomon, for who would look for such an artifact among pagans? The Grail is an elusive charge. Rumors of its existence abound in all four corners of the world, and it is only through a discerning intellect that I have traced its whereabouts to an isolated island monastery. It is on this matter that I must beseech your grace's aid. I have arrived here with an empty purse, and the locals, being either loyal to their pagan wise men or to Arthur Pendragon, are refusing me food and shelter. If you wish to obtain the Holy Grail before the knights of Arthur's court, it will be necessary for me to hire boats and boatmen, and to rally the local population to our cause through that ever-effective tool of persuasion, gold. Please dispatch some to me forthwith. I am currently lodged in the house of Donald a Miller, outside of Lanark Town. I humbly remind your grace that once I present you with the Grail, all of Britannia will flock to the banner of Lord Ghent, rightful ruler and high king, and neither this upstart Arthur nor his rival Mordred. I await your charity. Sincerely and earnestly, as always, your faithful and courageous servant, Aelfric of the Outer Isles, son of Alardane. Aelfric smiled, lowered his quill, and sealed the envelope with beeswax from the candle that burned beside him. His signet ring pressed the seal of House Alardane into the yellow wax, a cockatrice in fighting stance, wings outstretched, neck and beak forward, lizard tail curling under its legs. The letter was neither poetical nor allegorical, but it would do the trick nicely, he thought. He wasn't quite as destitute as his writing indicated, but he was a man of taste and wouldn't last more than another month on his current budget. Besides, he needed to hire some local muscle before he could raid the island monasteries in search of, quote, the Holy Grail. Whatever non-Grail artifacts he happened to keep for himself or sell, well, that was no one's business but his own. He hoped there would be books. This northern existence was dreadfully dull. Sir Alanbart was of an average height and weight, though somewhat fleshy, especially around the waist and under the chin. He had pale skin, ice-blue eyes, and receding nut-brown hair. Scruff shadowed his square jaw. He looked older than his 28 years, seeming to be nearing middle age at first impression. His mother used to mock him, saying that he'd been born wrinkled and never smoothed out. Perhaps she spoke true. He'd had lines on his forehead, under his eyes, and at the corners of his mouth for as long as he could remember. The crow's feet that furrowed the skin outside of his eyes, however, were a new development. But he fancied that they added some sincerity to his smiles and some gravity to his demeanor. The only child of a poor but loyal knight, Alanbart didn't exactly take to his birthright as he should have. While he could not be described as frail, he wasn't stout, and his aptitude for swordplay and, indeed, everything that required hand-eye coordination was well below average. In fact, he had inherited many more of his sickly, scheming mother's characteristics than those of his father: bad circulation, cold hands, a touch of anemia, a quick mind, and a penchant for dishonesty. Oh, and a love of money. About all that he got from his father was a tendency to drink heavily. Well, heavily for a man of his unimpressive physique and stature. He paced over to his straw-filled mattress and collapsed with a groan. He didn't like the north. It was a cold, damp place, without much in the way of beauty, at least in regard to the women. Aelfric sighed and pried the cork out of the bottle of cheap white wine with his dagger. He was about to put it to his lips when he heard a commotion outside. A child cried, a dog barked, and he heard a number of male voices talking excitedly. The sounds came closer in what seemed to be a collision course with his door. Aelfric winced. "Damn," he muttered, and took a quick swig, which spilled down his shirt. Before recorking the bottle, he sat up, pulled out his sword, and arranged himself so that it might seem like he'd been sharpening it all evening. Just as he got in position, a loud knock rang through the thin door to his room. "Come," he answered, and wiped the dribble of wine off his chin and tunic. A swarthy collection of penniless peasants poured into the room, led by Donald the Miller himself. They appeared threatening in the flickering candlelight, the playing shadows of which detailed the topography of their gaunt and pockmarked faces. The largest and ugliest of the trespassers shoved forward a thin, straw-haired boy of about 12 years of age. "Tell him, young Andrew," he muttered. The boy looked down at the muddy sheepdog that stood at his feet. "It's my sister, lord," he said, rather self-consciously. "We were out herding my father's sheep like every day, when a giant came up out of the valley and took her. Just like that, he did." The boy finished with a motion that indicated clubbing and stuffing something in a sack. Aelfric sighed and stood up. "You say a giant?" he asked, dropping his voice an octave. Young Andrew nodded. "How tall?" "He was 20 feet if he was a foot." "And he carried a club?" A nod. "And he took your sister?" A nod again. "And did he take any sheep?" The boy shook his head. Aelfric smiled without his eyes. "Well, no harm done, then. I doubt the giant will treat her any worse than her husband would have at a marriageable age. In fact, he has saved your father a dowry and the cost of a wedding." He clapped the boy on the shoulder. Dirt fell to the ground, and Aelfric filled with revulsion to see a louse crawl up his wrist. He flailed his hand, trying to remove it, and continued abstractedly. "And you have all your sheep, indeed even the company of an old sheepdog, which is far superior, as I'm sure you will agree, to the company of a sister." He bent down to scratch the dog's head, but drew his hand back as he imagined the lice and fleas upon such a hairy mutt. It obliged him by sitting up tall on its front legs and scratching earnestly behind its left ear with a rear paw. Aelfric stood and herded the boy toward the door. He looked dismissively at the rest of the uninvited guests. "Can any of you gentlemen think of any other reason for bothering me at this late hour?" Not giving them time to answer, he continued. "If not, then I suggest," he motioned to the door, "that you all go find your homes, bottles, or gutters, and leave the nightly decision-making to a night." At this the boy broke into tears. A high-pitched whine began deep in his chest. The burliest of the crowd leveled a calloused finger at Aelfric and shouted, "If you're a knight like you say you are, and a knight of the Round Table and King Arthur, then you'd best find that giant and young Andrew's sister, or you might find this land a sight less friendly than you did before." "And I thought you knights always helped people," came a voice from the back, "especially women and girls. And aren't you supposed to be hungering for glory like killing a giant?" Aelfric sighed. He knew where this line of questioning was going. His grin faltered. He closed his eyes for the count of 2 seconds to regain his composure. When he opened them, he was all smiles. Dropping his voice yet another octave, he explained, "Well, of course I'll help if that's what you're asking. I was just endeavoring to find the most equitable solution for all involved. But it appears that this boy genuinely likes his sister. And that being the case, and the giant endangering the town, I see no choice, and indeed my liege, King Arthur, would see no choice, but to slay this giant and save you all." A rumble of approval and a couple of "hear-hears" came from the crowd. "There is, however, no point in doing anything tonight. It's too dark to track even a giant, and besides, I must take time to ready myself for travel and battle, Aelfric said. And escape, he thought. I will emerge to track this giant on the morrow. You need fear nothing. After the crowd left, Aelfric uncorked his bottle for a second time. He took a swig and swished the vinegary liquid around in his mouth before swallowing. He made a disgusted face, and then followed it with a couple of big gulps. Well, he mused, my time in this town is over. He started packing his things and glanced over at his armor. At least he could make a show of it, he thought with a smile, polishing the tarnish off its corners. As he shined his inherited and resized armor, he imagined the scene that he would make in the morning. He'd get up and leave the town in a grand show of bravado, the brave hero off to fight the giant, never to be seen again. He could ride north to a new town, modify his letter to Ghent, and await his gold there. That was the sensible thing. There was likely no giant anyway. The boy was obviously lying. Why would his father send two of them to watch the sheep when one boy and a dog would do the job alone? And why would the boy run to town instead of straight home? And why would he leave his sheep, especially if the giant didn't take any of them? He stood to lose too much to poachers or wolves if he did that, particularly in the night. He would have at least left the dog to watch the flock. Yes, there was no giant, and no sister, just a glory-hungry, story-happy shepherd boy who, instead of crying wolf, was crying giant. After telling himself this, Aelfric felt much better. He smiled as he fluffed the sulphur-yellow plume in his helmet and set it back on the floor. For now, he would drink more wine and get an adequate night's sleep. Chapter 3. The Devil's Rookery. Heather scanned Malastaire's quarters. The tower itself was Spartan, but this room seemed to have many of the comforts of home. A mildewed tapestry depicting a scene of knights and ladies hawking hung on the wall. A large, roughly hewn oak-framed bed graced the leftmost corner of the room, and a number of thick black and gray wolf pelts covered the gritty flagstone floor. A dying fire flickered in the fireplace, almost collapsed to embers. Across the room a stunted archway led onto a small balcony. Beyond that loomed a 30-foot drop to the damp gravel and a 12-foot climb to the top of the palisade. She wondered if a watchman stood at guard atop the tower. Probably. Malastair was a military-minded man, after all. There was no moat. That made things more difficult. She couldn't jump and expect to survive, and she couldn't wait here for stone-faced Girth, whoever he might be, and Malastair to arrive. She shuddered at the thought of his cold lips and bit back on a feeling of nausea as she recalled his snuffling inhalation. Of course she assumed that most of it had been an act intended to scare her, and so melodramatically carried off, she thought, that the whole episode and Malastair himself would be laughable if he wasn't deadly competent with a blade, and if he wasn't the lord of this place. There must be a way out, she thought as she looked around the room. The idea seemed a bit overdone, but her first thought was to use the tapestry, bedding, and pelts to make a rope and climb down. Malastair, however, had a fondness for dogs. Indeed, even his coat of arms was a grey wolf, and no doubt they could track her and catch her before she got a message to anyone. She thought a bit more and came up with nothing. What if she faked a rope escape from the tower and hid under the bed? They might go off searching for her, and 3 or 4 hours later she might make her way down to the stables and escape with a horse and at least a chance to get to the nearest village. She could think of nothing else on such short notice. In any case, she reasoned, things couldn't realistically get worse. She set about making a rope. She needed to work quickly, for she had no idea when the master of the tower would arrive, and she needed to work quietly because a guard waited outside the door. It was simple work, though, and she made good time. She tied one bedsheet to another, to the tapestry, to her cloak, to a pelt, and so on until she'd convinced herself that the length was adequate to climb down. She did doubt whether it would hold her weight, but that didn't matter. She tied it to the bedpost and threw it from the window. It stopped about 12 feet from the base of the tower, but it was more than enough to look the part. Slinking back into the room, she wedged herself under the squat bed to await the arrival of Malastair, and prayed that he was neither as smart nor as observant as he pretended to be. She didn't have to wait long. About 3 minutes after she hid, the door opened and 2 pair of boots tromped in, halted, and ran to the window. "Girth," she heard Malastair say with urgent calm, Get down to the base and scour the area. She can't have gone far. Assemble the hunting parties with hounds if necessary, and send for Rabordath. I may have a use for him." One set of boots left. She watched the other stand at the window for a few minutes until another form arrived at the door. This second visitor wore soft shoes, but they couldn't be seen under the flowing crimson cloak that enwrapped his whole body. A red-dyed wolf fur lining ringed the lower hem and was turning gray from exposure to dust and dirt. The iron tip of his cane tapped the floor between every silent step. "Rabordath," Malastare said. "I came as quickly as I could, my lord," a deeply nasal, unctuous voice responded. "What service might I render?" "Arthur's attractive maiden," Malastare described her with contained venom, "has escaped down this rope." He tossed it on the floor. "I trust that you have a spell with which we can track her." "I do," the newcomer replied, "but I need something of her, a hair or two perhaps, to make the spell function, and it will take a few hours to prepare. I hope that your men may find her before that." "They will." Malastare sat on the bed. The wood slats bowed, and a few loose straws fell to the floor. "You may save your spell, for we will have her sooner than it would be ready. However, I must inquire, how are the preparations going?" "Well," Rabordath answered smugly, "quite well indeed. I need only wait for the blue moon to take Arthur's blood with his own blade. That gives us just 2 days before we can conjure the monster." "Then I will dispatch our rider to Mordred at once, and we will greet him with a proper welcome." Malastare laughed. "What fortune to capture Arthur here, in my own realm, instead of having to track him and steal him from Camelot. It troubles me, though. Why did he come here? What possible purpose could be served in his coming north?" "I don't know," Rabordath replied, "but it's lucky for us he came. With the royal blood we should be able to conjure quite a creature, certainly a far more powerful beast than we could have made with the blood of that paltry and self-important Thane of Glamis, who's been languishing in your dungeon for half a year. And I need not point out to you that we must recapture the girl as well. The conjuration requires the blood of a king and the blood of a virgin, cut with a silver knife that has never before tasted blood. The more highly born the virgin, the more powerful the creature conjured. It's a fairly simple calculation. And," he laid unusual emphasis on the word, "she must retain her virginity until the conjuring?" "Yes, yes," Malastare dismissed his concerns. "And when we summon it, the beast will be under your complete control?" "It will be at first," Rabordath answered. He seemed to hesitate a moment before continuing, "but it will grow phenomenally harder to manipulate, and, by my calculations, after about a year it will have strengthened enough to be near invincible, and will care little for the whims of its conjurers." "So we can use it and then dispose of it. That is acceptable. Once Arthur and Mordred's armies are annihilated, and we have left most of Britannia in flames, they will call me king, and we can slay the beast ourselves." Rabordath faltered. "I somehow doubt that we would be able to defeat the monster after that time. Dragons are notoriously resistant to both weapons and magic. I think it best to give the thing to the north. It couldn't keep a territory larger than that anyway, and this area is nearly a wasteland already. And," he added in a sly voice, "this realm is always in revolt against any king besides." "Why not obliterate it entirely?" Malastare sounded jubilant. "Why not? The smell of it nauseates me. Stagnant fens and rancid rock coasts, croaking ravens and screeching gulls. Why have I spent my life holding lands like these? I will be well rid of this place." Rabordath laughed. "Yes," Malastare continued, "I am quite agreeable to that plan, quite agreeable indeed." He crossed to the window. "In the meantime I will find the girl, and you will continue preparations for the summoning. I want it ready at the first opportunity. If the girl isn't found, we may have visitors. Brush up on your incendiary magics, because if the Knights of the Round Table come, we may be overwhelmed here. and if Mordred comes uninvited, he may very well bring Morgana with him, and then we would see once and for all if your boasting has merit." Rabordath replied, "Yes, my lord," and swooped from the room, tapping his stick and trailing his crimson cloak behind him. Malastare relaxed on the bed and sighed deeply. Heather lay silent beneath the mattress, focusing on a few stray blonde hairs curled near the bed's leg, holding her breath and waiting for her opportunity to escape. Day 2, Chapter 4. Morning, Lanark Town. Ducking under the low arch of the miller's door, Aelfric winced in the dazzling sunshine. Of all the mornings for this dreary land to be bright, why this one? He gave up on shading his eyes and lowered his helmet's visor. He drunk too much again before falling asleep, and his head throbbed. He stepped in something slick and looked down to find his newly polished metal boot covered in soft green manure. Grumbling, he shook it from his foot. Bits of it remained between the articulations. He took a breath, rolled his eyes into his head, forced down a bitter laugh and the desire to vomit, and set his course for the stable. He must have looked quite the sight, he thought, as he strode across the street. People gathered to stare in small bunches, which made him feel more hopeful. Though he was not Percival, his armor was dented, worn, and outdated, these people rarely had the chance to see a knight, so they would still be duly impressed, especially with the sunshine glinting off its polished surface. He smiled inside his helm and gave the gathering crowd a squeaky wave as he entered the stable and looked for his horse. Taffy, Alanbart's stout, cream-colored Welsh charger, was well past his prime. Someone must have told the stable-master of Alanbart's imminent departure, because as the knight entered the building, a stable-hand led his horse to him, saddled, readied for a journey, and shining with a careful grooming. He took the reins, and with neither a word nor penny of thanks, then led Taffy into the sunshine. The crowd cheered as Alanbart rode out of town. His sulphur-yellow plume tossed and pennant snapped in the Highland wind, and he felt, as he often did on these occasions, quite knightly. At least, he thought, this must be how a knight who has talent with a blade or lance and prowess on the field of battle must feel during moments such as this. Even Alanbart could get lost in that illusion for a while. Unconsciously, his mind sought out a suitable verse. Fearless Roland rushed to that fray, lone and last, to die that day. Yet how he gleamed in golden sun, his mind it dwelt on battles won. His mail was hard and bright and new, his blade was bold and strong and true. His lance was long and straight and thick, the wrathful wind his pennant whipped. He laughed at the oncoming hordes, disdaining yet to blow his horn. Though through that fight he could not last, yet never was his fame surpassed. Roland, he thought, now there was a famous fool who martyred himself for pride, a fine famous fool, beloved, admired, and dead. Just like Beorhtnoth, Beowulf, Sigmund, Caesar, Leonidas, Achilles, Hector, and every other idiot who ever put his values before his life. He ducked to ride under the gate of the town wall. Alanbart, take a lesson from history. Love yourself and stay alive. A loose clutch of boys and dogs followed him some distance from town, but he knew that they would tire of the journey and head back to their hearths for a meal and a safe bed. As he expected, in groups of 2 and 3, they all did just that, until about 1 league. A league is a general measurement of how long a man can walk in an hour at a good pace, roughly 3 miles by modern calculations. Out, the only one boy and his haggard dog remained. About 100 yards later the boy spoke. "The giant's this way." He gestured to the west. Alanbart lifted his visor and swore out loud. It was the same straw-haired boy who told him the story last night. Young Andrew, was it? If he left, the whole countryside would know that he was a sham. He closed his eyes again, frustration threatening to overtake him. Of course, he thought, if the boy doesn't make it back to town, who would be the wiser? He considered this, but as logical as that course of action might be, he had the vice of cowardice and a notoriously weak stomach for blood and gore. No, he couldn't eliminate the boy, which left one option. "Andrew, is it? You seem like a brave and trustworthy lad. How would you like to be my squire?" Alanbart asked. I've been in need of a squire to lead my horse, sharpen my sword, and cook my meals. What about it, lad? Are you up for helping a knight?" The boy looked at him and blinked. "Of course you'd have to leave this life behind and follow me wherever I go, and our first stop will have to be—" "No, my lord, I'm happy with my father and sisters," the boy answered. "I'll be 12 years old in a fortnight, and we're going to roast a fat haunch of lamb." He smiled, smacked his lips, and thumbed his hand southwest. "The giant's this way," he said, and headed into the hills. "Come on." Aelfric opened his mouth, stared for a moment, and then closed it. It seemed that nothing remained for him to do but follow the child. The journey would buy him time to think of another plan. In any case, he needed time to walk taffy. The charger was getting old, and Aelfric could never be sure when he'd need the horse's speed and stamina to beat a hasty retreat, even if, he told himself again, there was no giant. He sighed, dismounted, and led his horse off the trail, swishing into deep grass and through low-clinging purple heather flowers after the boy. Beads of moisture and clumps of grass seed collected on the legs of his polished armor. Soon the beads formed droplets, and the droplets ran together in tiny rivulets down into his boots, which already began to soak through. "Damn," Aelfric swore. Chapter 5. The Heath. Heather hurried through a wet pasture. Untended sheep grazed to the north. The sun peeked over the hills and began to warm her, but dew had soaked her dress, and she'd parted with her cloak back in the tower when she'd tied it into the makeshift rope. Her plan to steal a horse had been thwarted by a well-placed guard, but she'd managed to escape through the front gate and traveled in the direction that she thought lay inland, toward the faint indigo and then bright lapis of the soon-to-be rising sun. She ran into Malaster's men once in the night. As two of them returned to the castle, one stopped to relieve his bladder nearly on top of her. She lay still under a clump of briars and avoided his notice, but the outmost hem of her dress got the worst of the encounter. Now the sun shone, and she needed to find a cottage or shepherd to give her directions. She hadn't thought it through from there. Perhaps a wandering knight might help her. Unlikely. Perhaps she could find Sir Gawain. Her heartbeat quickened at the thought, and her chest swelled with hope. Gawain had been riding forward as advance guard when Malaster ambushed Arthur's party, and as far as she knew, he'd missed the battle. The possibility of meeting him, though, was not good. She knew that her best option would be to steal some peasant's clothing and make her way south along the road until she came to Arthur's kingdom. Perhaps— Heather froze in mid-thought. A muted but clear bark sounded a few miles back. She could only assume that Malaster's men were on her trail, using the hounds to run her to ground. Forcing control over an eddying stream of panic, she picked up her pace, hiked up her skirts, and jogged up the hill through the grass, collecting yet more beggar's ticks and bits of thistle in her hose. And that concludes today's reading. We have now read the prologue through chapter 5. When I get time, I'll try and do another one of these, and we'll start off on chapter 6. Again, my name is Scott Howard. I'm the author of 3 Days and 2 Nights, an amusing Arthurian adventure. It's being published through the Piedmont Journal of Poetry and Fiction, www.piedmontjpf.com. If you'd like to read more, we're publishing it in serial for free until July of 2016 when the actual book comes out. Feel free to read more. We appreciate your time and your interest, and come back and see us again. Thanks a lot.